Hey all, Niall from Alternative Review here, and today I'm bringing you a video on not only my game of the year for 2019, but my game of the decade, Control. Brought to us by Remedy Studios, who just happened to have made another game close to taking game of the decade for me personally in Quantum Break, they've managed to strike gold in a way I've never seen before. The universal praise for Control was something I personally didn't see coming. Even with all the faith I have in Remedy, their projects still seem to split opinions in many cases. Control was also somewhat a sleeper here, as the advertising around the game was done in a fairly streamlined manner, very few story trailer adverts, showing at a few expos and some dev interviews in the lead up to release. I don't recall any major advertising for the game, and that usually tells you one of two things. The studio thinks the game will speak for itself, or they're not actually that keen on showcasing the game for fear of failure. Either way, the quality of Control really did speak for itself, and it didn't take long for its August release for people to label it a Game of the Year contender. But why do I put it on a pedestal the way that I do? I mean, the 2010s were full of fantastic games. I mean, with some of my other favourite games being Diablo 3, the Resident Evil 2 remake, Quantum Break, Alan Wake. Wait a minute. I really like Remedy games, don't I? Still, what is it about Control that stands out over the hundreds of games I've played over the last 10 years? Well, the biggest thing is atmosphere. I've never played a game like Control that made me feel the way I do for the entire playthrough, which was just constantly on edge. I mean this in the best way possible. The only game that comes close is indie darling Gone Home, where the atmosphere the game creates completely clouds your judgment of the game, and you start to jump to strange conclusions in your head about exactly what the experience is. For me, at one point, I was convinced that Control was a flat-out horror experience, but that's just because the game never let me feel safe in any encounter at any part of the game. No matter how well I upgraded the main character Jesse Faden, who we will come to in a second, I never felt like I was fully, well, in control. So let's go back to characters. Jesse Faden is a masterclass in the video game protagonist, and further proves something that Remedy have done with quite a few of their heroes over the last few years. We don't need an information dump when we start a game. We don't need to feel like we're best friends and have the protagonist's entire life story before we've even taken control of the character. In fact, a better story can be unraveled if we actually know very little. And boy, we know nothing about Jessie when you initially take control of her at the game's opening. There's a short monologue peeking behind the curtain of reality and how she came to be in the situation she is, and that's that. But Jessie isn't the only character in the game. There is a supporting cast of characters and personalities that, if you are willing to take the time, they're just as intricate as Jessie, and just as interesting. This is where Control really feels like Remedy's magnum opus, because there isn't really a single character that feels underdeveloped or just as a transitional kind of roadblock to get you from one mission to another. There are no, as you'd put it, just quest givers in the game. My personal favourites from the characters are Dr. Darling, his assistant Emily Pope, and also Frederick Langston, who you don't meet until fairly late in the game, but he left a lasting impression as a strange change of pace and maybe even a bit of a comic foil character that I absolutely loved interacting with. Although back to Jessie, and as the game goes on, we slowly uncover more information about her ultimate goal, and what exactly she's willing to do to accomplish it. Hell, her ending up as the director of the FBC is just a means to an end after all. What's the FBC, you ask? Well, it stands for Federal Bureau of Control, the undercover government organisation that hides in plain sight to take care of altered world events and keep objects of power safe in order to learn more about them and maybe even harness their power for the greater good. The FBC takes residence in the oldest house, where the game is set entirely, And we learn early on that this house is just there. Not hidden, per se, but not entirely visible. Not to those who don't seek to know its existence. Throughout the game, you'll pick up plenty of files that teach you more about the game, about what an altered world event is, about what an object of power is. But most of the collectors are everything from redacted memos to hilarious internal emails, or maybe even more unsettling accounts of altered world events. But then again, like many other Remedy games, the collectibles are not just there for filler or to kind of lengthen the game experience. They really create a whole extra level of depth surrounding Jesse, the characters, the FBC, the oldest house, and that whole story overall. I don't often take into consideration things like controller layout or general control structure when thinking about what makes a game great. Maybe just because there's rarely much difference between games now, and the only time it truly matters is for a game like the previously mentioned Diablo, where it can be impossible to play if the layout is broken. But for Control, it's entirely natural. Even early in the game, with no powers to speak of, you can kind of see where the game is going to take the controller layout. It's so basic yet intuitive. It just works, and it works well. As the game goes on, bear in mind this isn't some 30 to 40 hour trek. The main story clocks in at around 10 hours, depending on how you cope with certain missions. But even a full-on completion of the game only took just shy of 26 hours for me personally on my first playthrough on PC, and I think my Xbox playthrough came in at an even shorter 20 hours. But that's just from experience of knowing where certain things were and how certain missions were going to play out. I've seen some valid arguments that a shortened game should cost less, especially when there's no multiplayer aspect, but this isn't some indie walking simulator. This is a AAA experience from start to finish, and I'd have it no other way. Especially now that I understand how trying to fit in gaming around a family life is difficult. So being able to finish a game in 10 or so short sittings over a 2 or 3 week period is absolutely ideal for me. And it certainly doesn't lessen the experience overall. Granted, the game tries its best to hook you in the later game with some outstanding moments. No spoilers here, of course, but the Ashtray Maze section and the Polaris Mission overall, including its little fake out, if you know you know, are some of the greatest moments I've experienced in games. This is just Remedy in a nutshell, and that's exactly why I kind of see this as Remedy's big magnum opus, best of the best projects. It's gonna be so difficult for them to top this. I spent a good portion of the game making the mistake of trying to find something else I'd played, watched, or listened to in order to compare it to Control. I had very little luck because of just how unique it is, but then I went online and started reading some other people's opinions, and I found one that actually really clicked with me. X-Files. The game feels like a feature-length X-Files episode, and yeah, I know there's been X-Files films, but I'd rather not compare them to that. And whilst I know the similarities aren't quite there in the characters necessarily, the setting, narrative, and atmosphere really are. There is no need to find comparisons to any other kind of media though, because Control is truly enjoyed at its best as a standalone game. Even if you have no idea about some of the links to other Remedy games, whether it's the wonderful acting of Matthew Peretta as Dr. Darling, who voiced Alan Wake, James McCaffrey as Trench after also voicing Max Payne, or even Sean Dury, who played Dylan, Jesse's brother, and if you know that story, he was actually supposed to be the original Jack Joyce in Quantum Break before he was sent packing by, granted, much more famous Hollywood actor Shawn Ashmore, and relegated to the mere role of a taxi driver in the opening of the game. There are of course collectibles and files to find which will also link Control to other Remedy experiences, and there is rumoured to be some DLC that includes another Remedy game as well. I'm trying not to say too much here, but it just it means the game has more life past its initial story. And again, If you can't justify 50, 60 pounds for this game, but you can 50, 60 pounds for a Call of Duty and then however much on microtransactions, then we are very clearly different types of people. I really think Control might be the perfect video game. Or at least my perfect video game. It's what makes it my game of the year and game of the decade. You'll notice the absence of me talking about any bad points of the game, and if I'm perfectly honest, that's because there's nothing bad about it for me. Yeah, some texture issues on the PC version when it first launched, but it wasn't noticeable enough for me to be a major problem. And yes, those texture issues are there on the PS4 version that I played as well on the PS4 Pro. There's nothing that I came up against in the game that detracted from my experience in the slightest. And I haven't been able to say that about a game since... actually Resident Evil 2 now that I think about it. But Resi was a very close second behind Control for both Game of the Year and Decade for me. And to think that both were released in the same year, it just shows that we are truly on the cusp of the next big leap in video games. And guys, what a time it is to be a gamer. That's all I have to say today. Thank you for sitting and kind of listening to my verbal love letter for both Remedy and Control. All I'd say is if you want more content like this, like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. You guys have yourself an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you on the flip side.